thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us. We couldn't be more thrilled to release the survey results and to share the news of what we've learned through the survey. And honestly, we couldn't have done this without you. It was one of those crazy ideas of let's figure out how to get this survey out into as many people's hands as possible. And all of you partners really stepped up and put out the request to your members multiple times. And I know some of our businesses probably got the survey 2, 3, maybe even 4 times, but it worked. We had a really strong response, and I'm thrilled to say we got 1,549 businesses representing 172 different towns across New Hampshire. And that represents a variety of industries and sizes of companies. I think we all knew kind of anecdotally that our businesses are struggling. We knew that, but the survey data and the report that you guys will see in just a minute really quantified that problem and gave us some great ideas on how we can better support our companies, your member companies, and just businesses across the state going forward. And I think a lot of the news is, some of it was a little bit discouraging, but I think we're also really hopeful and excited about some of the innovations and the partnerships that the companies shared in their responses and that they plan to continue as a result of the pandemic. So that's like the hopeful piece. And 73% of them, which you'll hear in a bit, talked about how resiliency planning is going to be really important for them going forward. And I think that's where we can step in, SBDC can step in, but working so closely with all of you guys to make sure that we're supporting those companies and just really having a better handle on what those challenges and needs are. So I would love to turn it over kind of quickly to Andy for his thoughts kind of on the big picture of what this survey means for the state and for all of us as partners. But then Sean McKinley is going to dig into the report and can walk us through the abridged version, like Heidi had mentioned. So Andy, I'd love to hear from you.
Sure, thank you, Liz. So I'm Andy Smith. I'm the director of the Survey Center at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm full disclosure, I've been an advisory board member of the SBDC for I think almost 20 years now. So I've been engaged with what the SBDC has done and see them as a very important organization for businesses across the state and for policymakers in the state. So this, I think, is a really important survey of small businesses in the state because it comes at a time of real, social and economic crisis. And it allows us as policymakers, or help us inform policymakers about what the issues are that businesses are facing on the ground, what concerns they've had, what has been most troubling for them. So that's an important part. It also really represents the work of this broad range of partners that we have. You can see all of you that participated here online. This, I think, was one of the really bigger benefits of this because it points to a partnership that isn't just necessarily a one-time thing, but you all were helpful in a way that's going to help your organizations. And I think building these sorts of partnerships with these organizations across the state, including state government, is very helpful in the future, thinking about how we think about businesses. So I really want to thank everybody here for that help. So Heidi's, as Liz and Heidi mentioned, the real focus that we had for this survey, and I should say back, it's funded through the SBA. They gave us the revenues for this, but they were really interested not in just finding out what the problems are, but the issue is resiliency. And resiliency is a topic that I think we found out from this survey that most businesses don't consider. They don't really think about the problems or the crises that they're going to face until that crisis is already there. And then frankly, it's a little bit too late to think about what you're going to do when the crisis hits, when it's already there. So the COVID crisis, it's not really unique. Businesses have faced crises like these in the fairly recent past, certainly after 9/11, certainly after the financial crash in 2008. There were unexpected things that people hadn't planned for. And what we hope to do from this is help people to help businesses, first off, understand this concept of resiliency and why it's important, and understand why they really have to build these things into their planning going forward. And then finally, it's going to help the SBDC inform the workshops that they're putting together this fall to be able to understand more fully what it is that businesses across the state feel that they need. So in a way, this is looking at what's happened in the past, how people have reacted to it, what they need going forward. SBDC is hopefully going to be able to help fill that need with the aid of your organizations, so that if and when the next crisis comes around, businesses in New Hampshire will be in much better position to deal with those crises. So that's really why I think this is important. As Liz mentioned, the two questions that I think that really point out the significance of this issue of resiliency are, we asked people that before COVID, how many of their companies had a resiliency plan in place, however you define a resiliency plan. That's 19%. 1 out of 5 companies had some sort of a resiliency plan. After they thought about this, 3/4 of them think that resiliency planning is really important for them down the road. So this is done kind of like the slap in the face to wake you up, to wake you and your business planning up about what you need to do in the future. So that's why I really think this was an important project. The partnerships, the overall structure, the importance of resiliency to businesses, and for policymakers to understand that the SBDC is one of many partners, including all of yourself, who are able to help deliver on this issue of improving the resiliency of businesses in the state. So with that, I can go to Sean, and Sean can walk us through the major findings from that. And if you have questions for me later on, please jot them down or send them to me now, and I can maybe answer them by chat if I have to, but otherwise Sean can go through more details.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I'm Sean McKinley. I'm an associate researcher at the UNH Survey Center. And I'm going to share my screen so I can take you through the abridged report, as Liz and Andy mentioned. So we can go to the beginning here. This report, as everybody mentioned, was put together for the SBDC. We put together 2020 Business Resiliency Survey. It has a table of contents broken down by the broad concepts and broad kind of categories of questions, things that we asked about in here, so you can navigate pretty easily from there. Here on these first couple pages, we just have the key findings. If you're reading this yourself and you want to quickly go through and say, you know, just tell me broadly what the results of the survey are, you can see that pretty easily on these 2 pages. But what I'm going to actually go through and do is bring you through the report somewhat briefly, to talk to you about the results and be able to show you the charts and the graphs that I think help illuminate the results a little bit better. So that'll take us here to page 1, where we're talking about the status under the emergency order. And what's happening here is we're having the different charts showing really what happened to all these businesses during the governor's emergency order number 17 on March 26th. And you can see that a fair amount of businesses were declared essential. About 40% though were also declared non-essential. And we also asked some further follow-up questions about whether somebody stayed closed or whether somebody opened or remained open, even if they were allowed to close. And so among those businesses that were allowed to be open, those essential businesses, most of them, a little more than 4/5, said that they did stay open, but a few chose to close. Among those that chose to close, that 17% we saw there, we asked people, why did you choose to close? And you can see here that most of them were citing, at least in part, health and safety concerns as a reason to close, somewhat understandably. Other people mentioned reduced sales, and a somewhat small number of people said that their employees were unwilling or unable to work. Here you can see in figure 4, this is just a simplified chart showing you, the 3 different outcomes a business could have had from this, showing you that we can either be remained open, have closed voluntarily, or closed as non-essential. Let's see. Sorry. We also asked about the number of employees people had. This was designed to try to measure as best as we could, how people's businesses, how many people are working for them, and how their business has been affected in terms of their employees. And we asked them about different types as well. So we had the total employees, their full-time and part-time employees, and their other employees. And you can see in the chart how it varies from February until the current day. The current day is when they took the survey, which would be sometime in this time period and around mid to late June. And you can see that the total number of employees fell on average by about 4 employees. And the most measurable drop really was in the part-time employees. As you can see here, it fell almost by half, whereas full-time employees also fell, but not by quite the same amount. And down here you can see the number of employees that different businesses have, grouped by larger groups. So you can see that a larger proportion of employees had 0 to 1 employees. Those are presumably businesses that have only themselves, the proprietor. So they have 0. Some might have counted themselves as 1 employee, but that share of businesses grew from compared to February 15th. So you can see that there was a demonstrable change in the number of employees and the types of employees working at these businesses as a result of COVID-19, or at the very least in between these 2 dates. You can see here also just a more simplified chart where it shows the people who have more employees, the percentage that have the same number, and the percentage that have fewer. 11% actually did say that they have more employees than they did in February. A couple respondents mentioned that, if they're a seasonal business or they have some kind of normal variation there, that might account for some of that. But there's also likely that there are some businesses that were doing somewhat better or had some increased demand and therefore had more businesses or had more employees and had more business than they would have otherwise. So if you had more employees, but a lot of them had the same number of employees, but also 43% reported having fewer employees than in February. So that's a pretty significant change that we can see there. Here in figure 7b, we can see this is a demographics chart. The ones you've seen thus far are ones that are showing the overall results. So they're broken down just by everyone who answered. But here you can see the differences between different groups and how they answered. Any of these charts that appear this way and say by select demographics that you might see in the chart, in the report. These charts are meant to show those differences, and you can always see this overall line. This is the responses of everyone put together, and you can see that this is measuring fewer employees. So this 43% matches up here, but you can see that among different groups, people answered in different ways. Unsurprisingly, people who said that they closed voluntarily and therefore were closed during the governor's emergency order, they're far more likely to report that they have fewer employees. In fact, 73% of them say that they have fewer employees. This is also broken down by other groups, or broken down by industry type is one of the ones that appear most often. You can see that accommodation and food services, educational services, and healthcare and social assistance businesses, all of them had more than half of their respondents say that they currently have fewer employees. And those in the blue here are ones that are below the mean. So here we're seeing only about a quarter of construction businesses say that they have fewer employees. So you can see there's a pretty broad range of responses here. These charts generally will show differences from the mean. These groups will appear when they differ by 10% plus or minus, and when there's a significant amount of people in the group. So if there's only 5 people in the group, we don't really show those differences because it's such a small number of people that we don't want to draw conclusions where there might not be any. Here on the finances page, you can see that this is particularly striking. It's unsurprising, of course, that this is the case based on everyone's experiences of what's been happening because of COVID-19, that you can see that the vast majority of businesses say that their monthly revenue has declined as a result of COVID-19. And you can see that a fair amount of these people, 47% overall, say that their revenue has declined by 50% or more. So this is confirming, I think, what we would suspect, that there's a lot of businesses that are having a very hard time as a result of this, but this is quantifying this information rather well. And you can see, much like we were talking about with employees, where 11% said that they had more, here we're seeing 5% of people say that their revenue has actually increased as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic, and 12% say it stayed the same. So this isn't a insignificant, really, amount of people. This is still about 1 in 6 businesses, but we're still talking about the vast majority have had their revenue decrease, and most of those by a lot. And here, down here in the select demographics chart, again, you can see that there's a pretty big difference depending on the type of business. We're seeing that arts, entertainment, and recreation businesses in particular, they have had 76% of them have lost more than 50% of their monthly revenue. But you can see that larger businesses, those with more than 25 employees, only 13% have lost that much revenue. You can also see ones that are not very or not at all confident that they'll be operating in a year, those that were closed because they were non-essential. Unsurprisingly, really, a lot of these are appearing where they're saying that almost 2/3 or more have lost more than 50% or more, excuse me, of their monthly revenue. So these charts are really helpful in showing those disparate responses when they exist, so you can get a little more context about why the results are the way that they are. We also asked about the accounts receivable and deferred or modified payments to vendors here. And you can see that this is a little bit better news. There's a fair amount of people who say that they don't know or this isn't applicable to them for accounts receivable, but you still are seeing about half of responding businesses say that their accounts receivable has been slower, and about 15% say that nearly all of their accounts receivable have been slower, but a fair amount say also only some, and a quarter say that they haven't been slower. And in the deferred or modified payments, it's actually better news. We're still getting, or about a little more than a third say that they've had some deferred or modified payments, but 6 in 10 say they haven't had to do that. So it's a little bit more positive news there. We asked about which of these have caused you to experience financial losses. Decline in sales is by far the most commonly selected reason here. And you can see that other options here also some people mention, but decline in sales is by far the largest. Reduced hours of operation, being required to close because they weren't essential, a supply chain interruption. Some of these other elements also have impacted people, but not nearly to the extent of decline in sales, which seems on its face to make a lot of sense. And for this one, we have all of the different, we have a select demographics chart for each one of these. So you can see the percentage and the differences on each one of these, because this is a select all that apply question. So understandably, someone could say that a decline in sales has affected me, but also supply chain interruptions. So these are best thought of as almost separate questions about whether this is something that's affected you. Has this also affected you? So you can see lower on this page, and on the following page, you can peruse these if you'd like later. You can see the differences on each one of these where they exist. Between different types of businesses and how they responded in this regard. But you can see, like in some other circumstances elsewhere in the report, that particularly the retail trade industry were far more likely in almost all of these to report that that this has caused them to experience financial losses, most of these. So people in that retail trade type of organization, they were more likely to select many of these as things that had negatively impacted their financials. And then we asked people, really try to get a little bit more context from this question and say, well, you might have selected this, but how important really was that of an impact on your business's finances? You might say that a supply chain interruption happened, but maybe it was momentary. So let's ask you, well, which of these are most important, second and third most important? And this really just buttresses what we saw in the previous chart, that the decline in sales is really the dominant thing that people are mentioning that has had the greatest impact on their business's finances. Both the largest amount of people selected it, and most people who selected it are saying that's the thing that has had the most important impact on them. The other one being noticed that you can notice here is that being required to close because you're not an essential business. That also garnered a fair amount of people saying that this was the most important thing to impact their business's finances. So these two, reduced hours of operation and being required to close, can very well be seen as the two next after decline in sales, most important things to impact businesses' finances. We also asked about relief programs because there are, as we know, various relief programs available to businesses, and we wanted to get a better idea of how exactly people have been utilizing them. And you can see here that, again, there's a pretty clear answer here that the payroll protection program is utilized by about 6 in 10 respondents, which is pretty remarkable for something to be that consistently used by people. And then the other options, we have the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Advance and Economic Injury Disaster Loan. Those were used by about a quarter of people, a little bit more each. We also had the Small Business Administration Loan Deferment Program, was used about 1 in 10. And these other programs that we wanted to see if people had utilized, very few people had. These IRS programs, a USDA loan program, a few people mentioned other programs, but for the most part, it's pretty clear that these three clearly have the most, have people using them the most often, and in particular the payroll protection program. And here you can see down in the select demographics chart that larger businesses tend to use it more, those with 10 or more, more than 25, manufacturing, retail trade. Some of these other types of industries, you had about 3/4 or more utilizing a payroll protection program, but those with very few employees, or 0 or 1, and those in the arts, entertainment, and recreation industry, those less than half of people actually use the PPP for the same reason. We also asked about municipal, state, and private relief programs that people might have used, these being all the federal programs here. Here we asked about the municipal ones, and the Main Street Relief Fund was used by the most people, but not nearly to the same extent that people use PPP. And people also mentioned unemployment for their employees and for themselves. About 1/4 utilized that. These other ones, similar to on the previous page, very few people use them. About 7% use the child care fund, but things like WorkShare, the healthcare relief fund, municipal relief programs, these are pretty rare occurrences. And overall, people are far less likely to have used state, municipal, or private relief programs. About 38% say they hadn't used any of them, than people were likely to say that they didn't use any federal relief programs. And here again, there's some more select demographic charts if you'd like to go through those at your leisure and get some greater detail about what kinds of businesses were answering in different ways for these questions as well. Here we get to the resiliency topic. And I believe, as Andy and Liz mentioned, and I believe Heidi did as well, this is a pretty interesting result that very few people actually had resiliency or continuity plans before the COVID-19 pandemic. And here, again, the select demographics chart is quite helpful. You can see that larger businesses, perhaps unsurprisingly, are far more likely to have had them, 44%, so just under half, or more than twice as many as people overall, had these sort of plans beforehand, but smaller businesses less so. And you can also see that manufacturing businesses were more likely to do so. Those that currently have employees working remotely, healthcare, social assistance programs, all of those organizations, they are more likely to have these sort of plans already in place. But again, arts, entertainment, and recreation, which shows up a lot in these charts, so it shows that they deviated from the overall quite frequently, they were less likely than other businesses to have had one of these before. And here we can you can see what components were included in those resiliency plans among the people who said that they had them. We don't have any real clear outcome here. That about half say that they had a list of potential threats, and they had communications with and developed for important stakeholders, and that they had employees trained to implement the plan. But there isn't any one thing that the vast swaths of these people who did have a plan included in the plan. So that's indicative that these plans differ from each other probably quite a bit, and there isn't necessarily a uniform collection of things that these businesses that did have a plan that were all included in those plans for people. We talked about also how the businesses have managed their workforces as a result of the pandemic. Here we again see some pretty interesting findings about really the amount of people who say that they didn't do all of these things. You can see that less than half of people purchased PPE for their employees. About 40% maintained or brought back employees under the payroll protection program, which is also a significant number of people for a single program. Other people say that they're personally working without a salary. It's about 30%. You have about 1/4 say they're reducing employee hours, changing the layout of their business, providing health and safety training. Interestingly, about working remotely, we only had about 22%. We didn't ask if people had in the past, so it is possible that businesses might have had employees working remotely before taking the survey and no longer did. But that's how many we were recorded in around mid to late June when people were taking the survey. And about 20% had furloughed employees or laid off employees. Very few say that their business had closed permanently, which of course is a good sign. So this is also a very kind of intensive selection of questions that it might be helpful if you'd like to go through and read that more closely, because there's a lot of meat in this question to dig into. Here we're talking about the modifications or innovations that you have implemented. Which of them have you actually done as a result of this? We talked about some of these similar concepts before about physical changes to location. 30% did so. Employees working from home is around the same as what we saw earlier. Offering new products and services. So this is a pretty interesting result about home delivery and about takeout. Manufacturing PPE, not too many people were doing that, but we are seeing a fair number of businesses using or doing at least one of these innovations. In fact, about 3/4 of them say that they did one of these or something else. So it's an indication that businesses have been innovating and taking steps as a result of this, and not simply staying still and doing exactly what they'd done before. And further in that regard, we asked people in an open-ended way. We were asking them about what's one thing your business has done in response to this that's been successful, trying to get a little bit of insight into what has worked out for people in an open-worded way. And what I did is I went through and coded this as best as I could. That can be a little bit tricky when it's a very broad question and people answered in a lot of different ways. But I managed to group it into a couple different areas, broad ideas about what people have done. And one of the most popular ones is they've changed how they deliver or produce the products or services that they offer as a business, which makes sense given all the practicalities that we have with the business. But there's a lot of interesting results in there. People talked about in implementing remote or virtual work, protecting the health of employees or customers. A lot of people spoke about that with great pride, that they were very happy that they'd managed to maintain their business and still be offering things while at the same time ensuring that their customers and their employees and themselves were still healthy. And one thing that we didn't really anticipate, and similar, we didn't give similar options in other questions, is a lot of people, more than 10% in fact, said that they practice better external communication or advertising as a result of this. So a fair amount of people mentioned that they've had to go back and think, well, how am I going to advertise better? Should I be using things on the internet? And both, I think, from a sense of need, because obviously there was a huge disruption and fewer customers, but also people mentioned, a fair amount mentioned, I recall, said, well, it did give me time to sit down and think about what I've been doing with my advertising, my external communication, and how what kind of vendors I have, and all of these other things that people kind of mentioned, was in some ways allowed them a moment's respite to think and to try to figure out what they should be doing differently. So that was an interesting finding that we hadn't really anticipated. Other people mentioned that they were proud that just that they kept working, reopened, or that they stayed in business. Other people said that the best thing that happened was that they received financial support. Clearly something that they, I guess, needed pretty well. And then adding new products or services, similar to what we mentioned up here. Some people were talking about that they were proud that they'd stopped working or that they'd managed to control costs and still be abiding by the closures and by the governor's orders, but still maintain their business. Other people mentioned improved internal collaboration. So that was another thing. This is a smaller group of people, but this is another thing that we hadn't really thought of initially as an option for people to express, but people expressed on their own that some people mentioned that that the crisis had forced their businesses to get together and work better within their own business. And some people even mentioned that Zoom meetings and having that kind of like the crisis element forced them to work better as a team. So that was another interesting finding that we hadn't really thought of. Some other people were talking about they were proud about supporting their employees, being adaptive, flexible, or calm. And a small number of people say that they donated their time or money to some COVID-related charity or somehow help their community, and that they were most proud of that. So then we'll move on to the topic of recovery. We gave people here a big list of things to choose from about how concerned they are about these issues as their business recovers. And you can see here that, again, perhaps understandably, the two clear things that are garnering the most concern from people are maintaining sales and revenue and maintaining customers. So more than half of people say they're very concerned with this, and the vast majority say that they're very or somewhat concerned. So these are the big two concerns for people, understandably so. Other people mentioned things like timely payment of bills and access to capital. We're still over 60% of people are very or somewhat concerned about those things. And then we have things like supply chain disruptions, liability, cleaning the work environment, access to PPE, being forced to lay off or furlough employees. Here we're getting down to about less than half, so it's a little bit fewer people who are worried about these things. Energy costs, bringing back employees, cybersecurity. Now we're getting down into relatively few people are concerned about these things. Access to testing, delayed hiring, defaulting on loans, and working remotely. Not too many people are very concerned about these things, though a fair amount say that they don't know or that these things are not applicable to themselves. But here, again, this is a pretty dense chart. There's a lot of questions asked in here and a lot of things to express. So I'll let you go through and peruse that on your own if you would like. I'm sorry, someone seems to be playing music in their car rather loudly, so pardon me for that. On the following page, we asked people about going forward. So we were saying that how important do you think the following things are to your or will be to your business in the future? And this is one of the things that Andy mentioned and Liz mentioned before about this resiliency planning. Now, this is part of this larger block of questions that we ask people. And we're seeing here, as Andy had mentioned, that almost 3/4 of people say that it's very or somewhat important, they think, in the future, resiliency planning. So this is something that the difference between those two groups, that only 19% had one before, but now the vast majority say that they think it'll be important going forward, is a very interesting finding, and something that in the future people are going to probably be considering differently than they were before the crisis hit. Other things that we asked here were about renewed access to customers. This is one of the things that they thought people thought were very or somewhat important. Others say that health and safety guidance and financial assistance were very important. You can see that as well, that very small numbers of people say that this is not very or not important at all. And then resiliency planning, we mentioned, regulatory relief, training on recovery and reopening best practices, hiring new employees, and cybersecurity. These are viewed by about a little more than half of people as very or somewhat important. So you can see that these are also interesting topics, and a majority still feel this way, but they're slightly less important, people think, to their business's future than these other ones, like renewed access to customers. So then we also asked, this was a particularly interesting finding because I was surprised at how high these answers are, that we asked people of those previous things we asked them about, these innovations and modifications that we talked about, that their business has instituted as a result of the pandemic, how likely are you going to continue using these in the future after the pandemic has passed? And with a lot of these, you're seeing most people are saying yes, they will continue to do so. So the pandemic might be producing changes that are not necessarily temporary for a lot of businesses. E-commerce in particular, 92% of people, and you can see here the end, so you can see the amount of people who said that they are now doing this as a result of the pandemic. So this is a large number of people. It's not just a handful who say, you know, I wasn't doing e-commerce before, but now I am. This is a pretty substantial group of people, and more than 90% of them say they're going to continue doing so afterwards. Other people mention that they're collaborating with other businesses in ways to try to reduce costs or find some other way of working with people for mutual benefit. Again, 90% of them say that they'll keep doing that. Offering new products or services, obviously that's a very broad category and can mean a lot of different things. But again, a lot of people said that they were going to be doing that, and more than 4/5 say they're going to continue offering those new products or services. Takeout is a smaller group of people. Obviously, it's not applicable to everyone. But again, 3/4 of people, these are a group of people who said that they didn't do it before, and they do now, and they probably will in the future. Even employees working from home, you have 70% of people say that they will continue doing that after the pandemic. We don't know that that will be everyone necessarily, but this is a significant group of people who say that they didn't have people working from home before, and they are likely to have at least some people working from home in the future. Physical changes to location, I'm sure we've all seen at the supermarket, things like that have happened, but a lot of businesses mentioned that they had done that as well. And of those, again, about 2/3 say they're going to continue doing so, which is very interesting. Curbside delivery, same story, and home delivery. So this is a particularly interesting finding in Figure 2 about the possible enduring changes to the business landscape as a result of the pandemic. And here we have a question that we realize could be a little bit striking to people, but we thought that would be helpful to get at what people are really thinking about their own business. And we asked them, how confident are you that your business will continue to be operating within 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months? And unsurprisingly, most people are quite positive that they'll be operating in a month and in 3 months, where we're seeing about 7 and 8 say that they are very or somewhat confident about that. But what could be concerning is as we get to 6 and 12 months, we're seeing less than half of people say they're very confident their business will be operating in that time. And of course, there's a huge amount of uncertainty in regards to COVID-19 and how it will be affecting us then. But this is an interesting question, because you're seeing that about 1 in 6 businesses say that within 6 months or within 12 months, they're not very confident or not at all confident that they'll be operating. And obviously, if that were to come to fruition, that would be a horrible thing to happen for the state's economy. So this is something that's rather interesting. And you may have noticed before in the selected demographics charts that show the differences between different types of groups. I also made this group of people who say that they're not very confident or not at all confident that they'll be operating in 12 months, they're their own demographic group. So where they show up and deviate meaningfully from other people, you'll be able to see that in the charts that I showed you earlier about selected demographics. And they understandably do show up in things like their amount of revenue that they've lost in the last, or their monthly revenue decline tends to be higher. Understandably, people who are more profoundly affected by this might be less confident in their business's future. And then we also asked about a more macro sense about the New Hampshire economy and how confident people are that the economy in New Hampshire will have recovered to pre-COVID-19 levels in 3 months. Very few people say that that's the case. It's less than a quarter are very or somewhat confident that the economy will be back in 3 months' time. But we get a little more confident, a little more bullish when we get to 6 months, when we have about 3 in 8 people say they're very or somewhat confident. And within 12 months, a majority think that they're very or somewhat confident we'll be back to pre-COVID-19 levels. But even among this group, just more than a third are not very or not at all confident that the economy will have recovered in that time, which is also a bit of a striking finding. And here in the demographics, you can see where all of the businesses are located that responded. As you might expect, we have somewhat of a concentration in the South, but we did get a lot of responses from the Lakes region north and from Western New Hampshire. And you can see that here, that we got about 31% from the Seacoast, but we still got more than a quarter from Northern New Hampshire and Western New Hampshire put together, and 20% from the Central or Lakes region. So we have a pretty good geographic dispersion of responses. And then here you can see the type of industry. So we took this from the standard different classification of industries, and you can see where people fall in here as well, and can see why groups such as retail trade and these other ones towards the top, they'll show up more often in the charts because they're larger groups of people. People who fall into the information category and things like that, they're less likely to fall into those charts because they're relatively small numbers of people, and we don't want to draw conclusions from very small numbers of people. And then we just did special thanks to our partners, you guys, and yeah, that's about the report in its short sense. Like I said, you're welcome to go through and read it in greater detail. There's textual explanations of all of these charts, similar to what I've just said, with perhaps a little bit more detail. And yeah, it's about 22 pages, so it's not too bad. And if you'd like to go through and take a read, then you can learn more about it.
Thank you so much, Sean. As you guys can see, there's a lot of great information and even more food for thought for us as we're kind of planning our next steps as SBDC, and as the rest of you, I'm sure, are going to be trying hard to work with your members and companies within each of your regions. So as Sean mentioned, this is the abridged report that Heidi sent, I think, in the chat, a link to the report. It will be live on our landing page for you to view. There's also the full report, which is 230 pages. So that one's a little bit more dense than this, but also a really great read and a lot more good information in there. If you're interested in that, you can send us a request and we'll send it over to you. But happy to do so. So, kind of going forward, what are we going to be doing? I think we're going to spend a lot more time digging into what the survey says and trying to really understand what the needs are for our businesses. I think this is a really solid sampling. I think the conversations that we've had with Andy and Sean, they feel good. That this is good representation of what's happening out there across the state. And we will be trying to figure out new programs and services to deliver, whether they're webinars and more online e-learning courses and other things like that, as well as where the need is in terms of specialties for our advisors to be working more closely with different industries. So what we really do hope is that you all, we're going to continue this partnership. I think it worked out really well to be able to access as many businesses and hear from them. But going forward, again, trying to continue that. We've done some work with lodging and restaurant. Mike, I think Mike was on the call earlier. It was great working with Mike and Nancy at Retail Association and with the Travel and Tourism Division to try to reach out specifically to some industries. But I think we need to do more of that. And I know there was some discouraging news in terms of the number of employees that had been decreased or had gone down, or the revenue. but I'm trying really hard to focus on the positives that we're seeing that come out of the survey, whether it's the collaborations and the partnerships that businesses have created, or the innovations that have come out of COVID, and what opportunities we have now that we better understand what their concerns are and what their needs are to be able to support them, but also to highlight some of the COVID success stories. We all need to be doing more of that and kind of spreading some of that good news. So you'll see more of that from us, and I think it'll be a good opportunity for all of us to do that.